So I just read The Mountain Sing by Phan Mai. Hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm going to mispronounce a lot of the names in this book. I don't know anything about Vietnamese pronunciation, so apologies for that. This is an incredibly powerful book. It's historical fiction, and it tells the events of basically one woman and her journey through life in the 20th century in Vietnam. Now, I sort of have a little bit of an idea of Vietnamese history. Just bits and pieces, like French Indochina, Japan, and the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere in the Second World War, and of course the Civil War and the war that the Americans got involved in. But I never really pieced it together and looked at it sort of from the perspective of one of the people who lived through all of these events. And that's, to me, what's so incredible is about this book, is it follows this woman born in 1920 who passes away in 2017. She lives almost 100 years, and the 100 years she lives through is so, like, I don't want to say rough. Rough is putting it lightly. The stuff she endures and manages to get through and keep going, it's absolutely incredible. The way the story is laid out is very, very cool. It's almost like was it Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the 100 Years of Solitude, where it's that story sort of follows generations of this family. This is kind of the same. It's still this one woman's life, but it starts when she's a child and talks about her parents and her siblings, and then it talks about her children, and then finally her grandchild, and at the end of the book, her great-grandchildren. So it does sort of follow this one family and all the things that this family goes through. But to me, the main character, the whole book is about this woman, Zhu Lan. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm going to refer to her as the grandmother from now on, just so I don't get myself in trouble. The book is from the perspective of her granddaughter, Hon. Again, hope I'm pronouncing that, probably horribly mispronouncing that, but we'll call her the granddaughter. And the narrative jumps back and forth between the granddaughter's POV and then the grandmother telling her stories of the grandmother's childhood and the life before the granddaughter was born. And so doing that sort of jumping back and forth, we get all of the eras of Vietnam in the 20th century. And because it's jumping back and forth, it sort of concludes at the end of the book with the few moments of peace that Vietnam has experienced. And so in that way, it sort of has kind of a happy ending. But it is a roller coaster of emotions. Just unbelievable. Now, it is historical fiction, but still, it really puts into perspective all these things that happened to the Vietnamese people and all these things they went through in such a short span of time. And the fact that they all sort of came out on top. Like, I mean, I had a Vietnamese friend about 10 years ago, and I remember he said to me, we kicked out the Chinese, we kicked out the Japanese, we kicked out the French, and we kicked out the Americans. So he sort of had this attitude of like, the biggest empires in world history have tried to conquer us, and we have stood our ground and managed to fight them all off. So I've had that sort of going into it, that idea of Vietnam as I mean, it's not a very big country at all, but the fact that they're sort of independent and they managed to fight back against all their oppressors. As I've sort of seen that as a really positive thing, but I never really thought of what it would have been like for a person to actually live through all of that. I mean, sure, the outcome was good. I mean, we could argue whether it's good or not, but that's not what this book is about. But the trials and the tribulations and everything that these Vietnamese people went through is almost unreal. I can't think of a comparison. I mean, I'm sure there are comparisons, like maybe Ukrainians, other Eastern European countries, the Balkans or something, and I'm sure tons of African countries as well going through decolonization. But wow, what a story. So I'm going to just sort of hit the main plot points, going chronologically, not as the book goes, which the book jumps back and forth to great effect. But I want to sort of go through it sort of chronologically to sort of keep it all straight in my own head. Just a note on the writing itself. So the author wrote this in English, which makes it sort of, it's not simple writing, but it's like a high schooler could read it with no trouble. It has very sort of straightforward language. Some of the dialogue feels a bit weird, but that's sort of a minor nitpick, and it could just be me. It is also very, very poetic. So the author herself is a poet, and it really shows. It's really poetic, beautiful language. So the story starts in the 1930s with this young girl who had been born in 1920, and she lives in a well-to-do family. Her parents are landowners, and they employ a couple farmers to work for them, and they do quite well for themselves. But it always stresses how hard they work. They're not like bourgeoisie leeching off the blood of people. That's another kind of a major criticism I have of this book, which I'll get to at the end. And so her family's quite sort of liberal and different. So the main character, she doesn't have to blacken her teeth. She also gets tutored, just like her brother does. And like her father lets her drive the carts and sort of treats her better than other women would have been treated in this society. And there's talk about how the French are sort of, Vietnam at this point is a colonial possession of the French, and so a lot of their taxes have to go to the French, but they're still getting by, they're doing well. And unfortunately, this is around the time when the Japanese have invaded and are sort of colluding with the French to sort of take over or control Vietnam. It's a really weird situation that I hadn't considered, when like Vichy France has surrendered to the Axis, and Japan's also in the Axis, but France owns Vietnam, but also Japan's invading, and so they're sort of getting screwed over by both of these empires at this time. And at one point, the character makes mention of how sort of kind and polite the Japanese are, and they're very nice. But then at another point, there is a bunch of Japanese that are collecting a whole bunch of women. That there's a lot of heavy topics in there, but it seems like these women either have been raped or will be raped. And these women and these soldiers then decapitate this woman's father just because he's sort of out on the road and they can. So they're hiding in the bushes while he dies. So that's sort of the first tragedy, is this woman seeing her father get killed. But they sort of persevere and they get through this. Then 1945 comes around. The Japanese have been defeated and have been kicked out of Vietnam. However, because of all of the things that they have done and all of the sort of forcing farmers to change over from food production to cash crops and a series of droughts and other things, the Great Hunger hits Vietnam, which mass starvation, millions of people die. And again, this woman and her family really struggle. She, at one point, manages to find a field of corn and they start eating it, but then there's this really evil guy who's like, no, this is my corn, and he beats this woman's mother to death. So she then witnesses her mother getting killed in front of her eyes and whips her, but she manages to sort of get away, and they sort of survive this great hunger. They get through the famine, which those two things are more than sort of anyone I know that has ever gone through. Just horrible, traumatic, life-changing events. And this is just the start of the story. I guess the next big thing would be land reform in the 1950s. So this takes place in the north of Vietnam, where communism is on the rise, or has always been with the Viet Minh, has always sort of been there. But this woman, she marries this man, and they're in love, but he is a very sort of democratic person. He's sort of advocating for liberal ideas like democracy and liberalism, and of course this does not go over well with his comrades in the sort of Communist Party, and so he gets poisoned. So they poison and kill him. So her husband dies. Fortunately, well, I guess not fortunately, even though her husband had died, they did manage to have a number of children together, 6 children in fact. So she has 6 children to look after. Her husband's dead, but she still has a brother to help her out, and they're still sort of running this family farm. Things take a turn for the worse, if they could get worse, when the land reform comes into play. So that is when, from my understanding, the Communist Party leaders try to sort of stir up some rebellion amongst the peasants and the working class, and to sort of rise up against landowning farmers and the bourgeoisie and traders and whatnot, and attack and sort of take over things for themselves. So sort of workers of the world unite, throw off your chains and whatnot. And so this character, Zhu Lan, she is of course a landowner. She employs farmers, but she sort of argues that no, we don't exploit them. We sort of pay them and we're really nice to them. And of course all the workers are like, yeah, we love this family. They're great, which we'll get to my criticism part. This is part of it. But the result ends up being that her brother gets killed. Her son, her oldest son, who is around 18 at the time, he gets captured, and she also gets sort of locked up with the rest of her children. Fortunately, there are some good Samaritans in this novel, and this one guy, he's the guy who helped her out during the Great Hunger. He also helps her out now and frees her son, who then takes off and then frees her and her 5 other children and tells them, you need to run, they're out for blood. And so that begins her 300-kilometer trek to Hanoi, which unbelievable. Now, it is a work of fiction, but again, there are probably people who did similar things to this. So this young woman with 5 children start heading to Hanoi. Now, her eldest son, Min, again, pronunciation's probably all off, he takes off at this point, and they do not meet again until 1979. I think that's the date. 20 years they do not see each other. Over 20 years. Unbelievable. And throughout the whole book, they're sort of building up to this. They're waiting for Uncle Min to come home. When is he going to come home? And we'll get to the very end of the book when he does show up. But this trek down to Hanoi, she encounters so many problems with kids getting sick. They're running into starvation. They're still being chased. They have to beg. And eventually what happens is she sort of leaves her children one after the other in like orphanages, infirmaries, with families that want their own children but can't have them. And eventually she makes her way down to Hanoi with only her baby left, the youngest child. And it breaks her heart leaving these children, but she's sort of determined that this is the only way that they will survive, and she will come back for them. So she gets to Hanoi, and she, through, again, series of events, like she gets robbed and has all her money stolen, and then she gets jobs and makes money and then gets it taken away, and she gets to her lowest point, manages to crawl her way back out of that hole, and then thrown right back in. But she keeps getting up, and she keeps, just the strength of this woman is unbelievable. So eventually she manages to get settled down, and through the sort of goodwill of others and support of some other people, she manages to get back on her feet and make the trek back through that 300 kilometers and sort of collect her children all back. She still doesn't have the oldest child. He's still not been seen since they escaped. And that's sort of how, because this is jumping back and forth, this is at the end of the book when she sort of gets all of her family back that's still living, and they sort of start their new life in Hanoi. So that sort of section of the book ends on a high. However, the start of the book, from the POV of the granddaughter in the 1970s, has the granddaughter being a very, very young girl looked after by her grandmother, who is protecting her during bomb strikes and air raids on Hanoi. And all of her aunts and uncles have gone off to war. Her mother also has gone off to war. So this is this main woman's daughter. All of her children have gone off to war. And through this sort of in the 1970s section, we see the horrors of war, and also the sort of meeting up with these aunts and uncles again as the war ends and they come back together, and all of the traumas and tragedies that these people have experienced. One of them loses his legs in a war and suffers from like depression and alcoholism, but he manages to get over that. And there's also an issue with him and his girlfriend, but in the end they get married and have children, so that sort of ends well. One of the children do die in the war, just doesn't come back. One of the aunts does come back, but there's sort of issues with her, and she ends up moving down to Saigon with her husband, and they sort of live a better life, and family relations are strained. And the youngest son comes back, and he's okay, but he's really sort of drank the Kool-Aid, and he's like full-on communist, and he is against the mother, who is his mother, the grandmother, who is now turned to black market trading to get by. So he sort of will not have any sort of relationship with his mother because of that, and he's sort of trying to climb the party ladder, and he can't be seen with her, and so there's strong issues there. The little girl has been waiting the whole time for her parents to come back, and eventually after years her mother does come back, but her mother is horribly traumatized. It's revealed through the course of the book that her mother was gang raped by South Vietnamese forces, because her mother had been a doctor for the North, and she had actually picked up a gun and fired it at the enemy. And then she, like I said, the result of this rape was a pregnancy, which she then aborted and had to bury her child that she herself killed. And the trauma, she's extreme PTSD, this mother's, and the family's trying to get through it, trying to help her out, and the daughter's trying to help her out, and it's a tragic story. And the whole time she's waiting for her father to come back. So her mother did come back, but this granddaughter's waiting for her father to come back. And the book kind of leads you on, like, there's still hope. And of course the characters still feel hope, but by the end of the book, it's sort of revealed that they're never going to find information about this man. He likely was killed in a bombing raid, and was just sort of, whatever was left of him was buried in a mass grave. And I guess that's just the truth of 20th century warfare, is that people, well, I guess warfare in any century, that people are going to die and no one will ever get information about them. That's one of the things that really stood out to me, is that the lack of connection. Like, we have the internet and it's so easy to remain connected, and even before that with telephones and whatnot. But during this whole thing, they go years and years without contact. There's no way to contact one another. And at the end of the book, they finally do find out 20 years later that the eldest son, what his story was. So when he had escaped during the land reform, he managed to flee down south to South Vietnam and got married and had kids. But his family decided to move to America, and then he was drafted and went and fought on behalf of the South Vietnamese army. And so he was fighting against essentially his parents. But he ends up with cancer, and when they come to him at the end of the book, he's dying of cancer and he can't even speak. But they managed to sort of have a quick family moment together. Not totally united. There's still a few brothers and sisters that, because of issues, aren't with them at this time, but they do have sort of their moments, and then the eldest passes. The cancer doesn't say if that's from a result of something in the war. They do mention Agent Orange, that one of these, I think it was the youngest son, the sort of the real Communist Party guy. His child is badly deformed and then ends up dying, I think. I don't think the child survives because of this man being sprayed with Agent Orange, which sort of had weird connections for me because I live very close to a place where Agent Orange was actually tested. And because of this child's deformities, his marriage falls apart, and then his brother, who again was exposed to Agent Orange, is really worried that he's going to have these same issues with their baby, but they managed to have a healthy child. And just so many horrible things that happen in the space of these 50 years that this family endures. It's incredible to me. And so you think you're going towards a happy ending. We have the granddaughter has lived through the bombing of Hanoi and the Vietnamese War, the Civil War, I'm not sure what you call it, the American Vietnam War, and she meets this boy and they really fall in love, and everything seems to be going well. And then when their two families meet, it's revealed that this boy's grandfather is that really evil man who had beat the grandmother and the grandmother's mother and had killed the grandmother by beating her to death way back during the Great Hunger. And so sort of all this trauma just comes back, and eventually that man does die, and they sort of agree, like, we need to heal, we need to move on. And so these two, they're still in love despite the grandfather, and they get married and have their own children, and that's how the book ends in 2017 with the grandmother passing. Just the incredibly powerful book and so easy to read. Highly recommend it. Now, my one big, huge criticism of this book is that, so the author's Vietnamese, fantastic, but it was written in English, and it was very much, in my opinion, written for an American audience. There are times, like when one of the brothers is talking about the war, when he comes across a group of American soldiers, and they're just young boys, and they're just playing in the water, and they're having a great time, and he doesn't see them as enemies, he sees them as just life, and then all his comrades shoot and kill these Americans, but he does not fire at them, he just watches as they die. And there's another time when there's an American helicopter that sees one of the brothers who's sort of hiding, and he knows he's there, but he chooses not to fire. And the Americans are never portrayed as sort of evil or doing something wrong. It's always, even though it's from a North Vietnamese perspective, they're always sort of seen as, oh, they're just sort of doing their duty. And anytime there is horrifying things like the bombing or whatnot, that's sort of a disconnect, and it's not sort of personal with the Americans, even though it is the Americans that are firebombing Hanoi, and it's the Americans that are deploying Agent Orange. The bad guys would be sort of the South Vietnamese soldiers, but also some of the North Vietnamese people as well. It's never the Americans. They capture one American, and people are like, yeah, let's beat him, let's get revenge. And of course the main characters are like, oh no, let's not do that. But also how the characters are like liberal, they're democratic, it's a kind of a very anti-communist book. This book really, I mean, obviously rightly so, there's a lot of things that the communists have done wrong which caused the Great Hunger and the land reform and whatnot, but the book feels like it is very much written for an American audience. So that would be my one big criticism of it. But I'm really curious what or how this book is sort of taken, or how this book is seen in Vietnam, or whether it's even really that well known because it has been written in English, if there's a Vietnamese translation, or if other Vietnamese have opinions on it. Because like I said, I think it does a fantastic job of exploring the story of this family, especially this one woman, the grandmother, going through horrible event after horrible event after horrible event, and picking herself up, and she just keeps going. She just, like, what an amazing person. But I do wonder how the portrayal of the Communist Party and the government and the war, and I wonder how that's seen in Vietnam. I imagine some Vietnamese have to blame the Americans, because, I mean, the Americans, what were they doing over there in Vietnam? Like, so many people died and so much death and destruction, and it was like millions of tons of bombs dropped, and then they end up just leaving and it was all for nothing. Yeah, when I think of the Vietnamese War, I think of like America's folly. What a disaster. But I wonder how it's seen in Vietnam and how specifically this book is viewed in Vietnam. But I haven't read anything that's that powerful, that so emotional. And anyways, that's The Mountains Sing. You really should check it out if you have any interest in the period or in history or life or family or anything at all. Just really, really good book.